never implement anything client-side as far as storing data. It should all be through sessions. Fortunately for us, Lasso actually has a nice built-in session manager. You can store it with session bars. It makes it really easy. You shouldn't be storing anything in headers and cookies. The only thing that should be in a cookie is the session ID, and that's it. Occasionally, for some sites, you might want to have a long-term cookie that has something that's more generic, that's pre-authenticated information, such as their language preference. So if they just say, when I come to the site, I always want to see it in English, then you'd maybe store that in a long-term cookie. But outside of that, you don't want to have anything else. And even with that cookie that's, that stores your preference, you always want to double check when it comes back in. Remember, it's not trusted data. And the best practice is when you have an application is you want to have your users use one application and your administrators use another. The reason you want to do that is because then your users won't be aware of your administrative application. It's harder for an attacker then to attack it. An attacker then can also force the administrator to do administrative tasks because it's two different systems which use two different cookies, two different URLs. It's a better way to go about it. Plus also you're less likely to allow a user to see administrative functions if those functions don't even exist in their application. All right, session management. As I'm sure you already know, HTTP is stateless. That means that every request that comes into the server looks more or less like all the other requests that come into the server. You don't know who they're coming from or why they're there. So by adding that cookie that has the session ID in it, you now can start to track and see who is doing what on your system. For session IDs, I know it's popular, a lot of clients like to have the option that if the cookie doesn't work to put the session ID in the URL. I caution you against doing that. It's insecure, mostly from the standpoint that that session ID then will end up in the referrer. So if you have links to other sites, then that session ID will end up in that link. It ends up in logs, it ends up in proxy servers. The user copies and pastes it into an email. It's now in the email. And you got to remember that session ID now is their identity on your system. That means if I don't even have to know their username and password. If I have their session ID, I can become them just by simply reusing it on your site. So you want to make sure that if you're implementing session IDs using the links, you're propagating via links, that you really understand the security trade-off for that. It's not a good idea, and I highly recommend you instead just stick with cookies, because it's not prone to all those issues.